Hey there, it's Cooper Codes. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the Riot API CORS error and how you can fix it. The basic idea behind the error is that you have some type of web client on the left here, whether that's React, JavaScript, anything on the web, and it's trying to make a Riot API call with a certain API key. The issue with this is that this exposes your API key to anyone using your web client, and so as you can see here, Riot specifies in documentation that a CORS error can result in your calls coming from a web client directly getting rejected pretty much. So it gives you a CORS error intentionally saying, we don't want requests specifically from a web client. So what is the overall solution for this? The solution is having a web client call a proxy server with your API request. So a proxy server is something that we can make to pretty much facilitate our API calls. And we are going to store our API key on the proxy server. Your API key is only ever on the proxy server. It's never touching your front-end web client. And so your user cannot see the internals of your proxy server code, so that API key that's being stored is safe. Here are some example GET request calls. So you'll see this request on the left. All it has is maybe an ID of a certain user you're trying to get the data from for, like, in League of Legends or the Riot API, you want, the data of a certain username. Then over here on the right, from your proxy server, you have this request that has the API key inside of it and that ID data as well. And so this is super important because it's showing how the proxy server call has that API key, but this front-end call doesn't have the API key, and that is super crucial for pretty much making the Riot API happy and giving you a good response. A quick note is we have to let React know that we're going to be using localhost 3000 as our proxy to prevent CORS. In this video, I'm going to create a basic project that I'm going to showcase right now. So this is the application we're going to create. It's pretty much a proxy server application that makes a call to our own server, which then calls the Riot API, which makes the Riot API happy, and it makes it so we can do more advanced things with the API, such as show a bunch of game data, for example. So if I look up the player VLOTs and I say click here to get the players' games, it's going to take a second, and then this response is coming from the proxy server we are going to create in this video, and there's way more data from these games than just the names and the KDA. This is just what I decided to show in the front end. And so as you'll see, we have game 1 and all the different players, game 2, game 3, game 4, and these are all coming from our proxy server call that is then calling the Riot API. So first, I'm going to start by creating the actual proxy server itself. So let's get into it. So we can get started by making a JavaScript file inside of a blank folder, and we can name this proxy server.js. And so all of our proxy code is going to be on one JavaScript file. So this is going to be super simple from that perspective. No crazy folders. Once we get into the React part, we're going to have the entire, create React app, of course. But for now, it's going to be super simple, just one JavaScript file. To actually create our server, we are going to use this popular technology called Express to just have a server that can handle HTTP requests. So we can include that by saying var express equals require express. Then we're also going to need this thing called CORS, which helps us get around the CORS error of our own server, which pretty much says, hey, this express server we're going to create, make sure that it allows any origin to access it. Pretty much any website, anything that wants to access our server, they'll have, the ability to access it. And I'll show you guys how to use that in a second. And then we are going to use Axios. So I'm going to say const Axios is equal to require Axios. And this is for doing requests from our server. And I've done a video before where I did Axios in the front end. And so this is actually showing you can use Axios also in the back end. So to create our actual server, it's pretty simple. All you say is var app is equal to express, which is a constructor and has a bunch of server code in there, but it makes it super simple for us. Then if we want this express server to actually use that CORS logic, we're going to say app.use CORS. And this is all you need to have your app be able to be accessed by our front end. Super important for this tutorial is you need to go to developer.riotgames.com. You need to log in with your credentials, and then you need to go to this development API key. And then you need to pretty much take this API key and copy it. Once you have this API key here, we can go back to our server over here, and we can say const API underscore key is equal to this string. You guys are starting to see how this could actually work, where this string, since it's only on our server, no one's going to be able to access it unless they can access your server. It would be, you're already at a significant security risk there. But this is all Riot cares about, is that your API key is being stored on your server instead of being stored on the front end. And so to have our Express application Express server listen to a certain port for requests, for example, we can say app.listen. Then we can say the port number, which I'm going to call this 4000. So this would be, just to add a comment here, we are going to be looking at localhost 4000 is where this port is, because we are on localhost, and then this Express server is going to be on port 4000. And we can do a little function here. This is common Express syntax, nothing out of the ordinary, and we can just say console.log server started on port 4000. So now our server is actually running, which is great. One thing that we need to do is go to your terminal, and we need to npm install all of these things above: npm install Express, CORS, and Axios. And this is going to add a package.json and the node modules to your application. So we can go over to package.json and we can see all the different dependencies we have. Another one that's going to help us out a lot is you do npm install nodemon. This makes it so whenever we make a change in our proxy server.js code, our server is going to restart. And so we can do that by pretty much making scripts inside of our package.json, having it be equal to a dictionary, and then we want a script for starting. And for starting, we wanted to run this code. We wanted to say, when I say npm start, I want the command nodemon proxy server.js. And this is very similar to just saying node proxy server.js. So starting this proxy server using node. Nodemon just means it's going to continually reset, as I mentioned before. So now if you do npm start inside your terminal, you should see server started on port 4000. So this is good news. That means that your code's running so far, and that means you're also not having any dependency issues. So this is great. So in this Express server, we want to be able to handle a bunch of different types of requests. For this video, I'm only going to make one GET request that our server is going to handle, because remember, this isn't like a full stack League of Legends, API tutorial thing. This is just showing you one way of how to get around the CORS errors for my specific website, and then hopefully it'll give you guys enough knowledge to create all the different types of routes you need. So let me describe what I'm going to make here. I'm going to make a GET request, and it's going to get the past 5 games from a user. So it's going to be to the localhost 4000/past 5 games is what I'm going to call the route. And so if we want to use Express to pretty much handle this type of request where you say get localhost 4000/5 games. So we can do that by saying app, which is our Express server, .get, and now we can define the actual route itself. So I can say past 5 games, and I'm going to make this an asynchronous function on the inside. The main reason why it's asynchronous, you don't need to understand the async stuff super well for this. Just know that when you're waiting on API calls, for example, if our backend is waiting on a Riot API call to be fulfilled, we need to wait for those API calls to get a successful response from them. So we can say request, which is coming from the user, and then response, which is something we are going to change and give back, which is common syntax for Express. This isn't really an Express tutorial, but pretty much request is everything coming from the user. Response is initially empty, and then you kind of change the response to give something to the user eventually when you're done. All right, so now that we're getting started, we need a couple things. One thing is we need a player name. For now, I'm just going to make a variable to hold the player name. So I'm going to say const player name is equal to the string of lots. And so now Riot is super picky about this thing called a player UUID, which is pretty much a universal identifier to a certain player. Riot makes us do an API call just to get the player's UUID from the player name itself. So let's make a function to help us with that. So up here, we can make a function saying function get player UUID, and we can take in the player name string as a parameter. And this is just going to be one Axios request. That's the entire functionality here. We're going to say return axios.get. I have another video where I discuss the actual Axios logic more in depth, but pretty much this axios.get is saying, hey, make a get request to whatever link is in here. So now let's make that link. So for this type of API call, what Riot wants us to do is to use this base Riot link, na1.api.riotgames.com. And now we need to actually do the specific route for this functionality. You'll see this is how you can build the routes from that stuff you see in the actual Riot documentation. Is you'll see something like this in the Riot documentation. I'm going to paste this in here. So I can say lol summoner v4 summoner by name. And this is all in the documentation. They even show you how to set up the request. It's pretty neat. And so then I can add the player name because that's what's expected next. So now we can add a parameter for our API key, which is beginning question mark, which means start the parameters. API underscore key is equal to, and then we can just add our API key const to the end of the string. So this is the full initial get request. And so what we can now do is this get request is technically a promise. So we can say .then, which means when the promise gets fulfilled eventually, we're going to take the response of the promise, and we can make a quick arrow for this. And I'm just going to console.log the response.data here so we can see that being, updated in real time. And I want to return the response.data. I know this is how the object is structured because this was the documentation is telling me. But response.data from this get request specifically gives us a bunch of different things, a object with a bunch of different things attached to it. One of those things is the PUUID. And in a second, we can take a look at this console.log to show you guys what I'm talking about when I'm getting this data object and then getting this property out of the object. But this is the player's UUID that we want. And then just in case there is an error, we can say .catch error, and then we can do an arrow error. So very simple syntax on the errors, just so there's something to catch an error. And so now we have a function that's going to allow us to get this player UUID, which is great. Just to explain this, because this Axios get request is a promise technically, and it's an API call, we want to make sure we use await when we call this function itself. I know that's kind of confusing, but one thing we can do here is saying, okay, const PUUID, get that player ID out of it. We're going to get this const, and we're going to call the function, get player ID there, then we can pass in that player name parameter we made. We want to then say await, which means make sure that this thing gets done so we have this PUUID for the rest of our code to use, and we want this promise to get fulfilled. We don't want to keep rushing ahead. Okay, so now that we have the player's ID, we can actually use a Riot API call to see, okay, look at this certain ID, and then get the past like 20 games or something like that. I think by default, the API call I'm about to use, it gets the past 20 games, all of their IDs. And so I'm just going to do that for now, but we can limit it to, only show 5 to our user, for example. So let's just say const API underscore call. For this specific call, it's coming from the americas.api.riotgames. So make sure whatever you're doing, for example, up here was NA1, down here is Americas, look at the Riot example calls and they will show you which one to use. And now we can go in here. I'm going to add this string where it says League of Legends matches v5, get the matches, and then by the player's ID, it now expects a PUUID here, and it expects a /IDs. And then we can actually copy this API key logic up here where it says add the API key as a parameter to the end. We can copy this and just add it to the end. This is common, all the different API calls, because every single API call is expecting an API key alongside it. So this full API call string here is the domain that we want to actually have an API call to. So now we can actually use this API call string we made to create an actual GET request using Axios. So how the overall logic is going to work is this, is do a GET request with API underscore call. It's going to give us a list of game IDs. So just like, strings that are just like, ASDF, and then they represent a certain game. Then we are going to loop through game IDs. At each loop, get the information based off the ID, which this is an API call. So you'll imagine it's actually going to be a lot of API calls. And if you're concerned with your application having a lot of different API calls, I would look into API caching. I'm not going to get into it in this video. And then one last thing here is we are going to save information above in an array, give array as response, as a JSON response to user. And so then the user is going to have an array with like a bunch of different game logic in each one. So I'll just give a little example of what we'd expect is game 1 object, game 2 object, etc. Something like that. All right, so let's get to work. We can do this first get API call by pretty much doing a const game IDs, because that's what this call is going to return. And it's going to be an await. Remember, await's important when you're calling to APIs, and it's going to say axios.get, and lucky for us, we have that API call above that is fully done. So we don't have to worry about anything crazy there. Then I'm going to do a .then, which is going to say, hey, from the response, give us the response.data, which our game IDs is going to be set equal to. And if it errors out, we want to catch and say error, pointing arrow function to the error there. And we should be able to console.log these game IDs, and it will like show us an actual ID here. I'm kind of showing you guys overall what's happening, and I could use something like Postman to like make a request right now and show you what the game IDs are right now. This is just an idea of how you can handle these calls overall. But right now, what this game IDs thing is going to be a list of game ID strings. That's what game IDs is after this point, after we do an API GET request to this link right here. So now we want to loop through the IDs, and we want to save every single game's information in an array of some sort. So I'm going to make an array for that. I'm going to say var match data array. Just going to be an empty array initially. And I'm going to say for var I equals 0. And I'm just going to say I is less than games, or game IDs dot length. I'm going to say -15. This game IDs is giving us a list of 20 strings. by default because we didn't tell Riot anything else. Because it's 20 strings by default, I'm just going to say -15, so it only gives us 5 games. Because every single time this for loop runs, it's going to do an API call. And so that can get pretty taxing, and you got to be careful on that one. And so I'm going to say I++, common for loop syntax for JavaScript, nothing serious. And I'm just going to make this logic easy for us. I'm going to say const match ID is equal to this array above game IDs is going to have, 20 different strings inside of it. And so I'm just going to say, hey, get us whatever game ID is at a certain index. And then now we're going to have a match ID, for example. Now we can say const match data. Here we go. The actual data we can get from the match. And so this is going to be await axios.get, and this is calling another service from the Riot API. You guys can kind of get an idea as to why a proxy server is actually kind of beneficial, is all this logic is stored on your own server, and you don't have to worry about a front end kind of handling all these different requests. But this API was going to be the Americas link again, so if you wrote that up here, I would say bring it down here, and it's going to be, okay, we have the Americas base link, and then we're going to get the matches API pretty much, and it's going to be matches API v5, and then how you get a match ID is pretty much putting the match ID here. There you go. And then that's all you really need, except of course, you need to get that plus API key stuff as well. That is pretty much the entire string you need there. You're going to have a dot then, and then this dot then is going to get that initial response. And we're going to do an arrow function saying get the response.data out of that. And then that's what match data gets set equal to. So just to be clear in that, match data gets set equal to response.data when you use a syntax like this. And then it's going to catch any type of error and pretty much error out. So this match data object, it's explained more in the actual API documentation, but this match data object has a bunch of information related to the match. And on that initial web page where I was showing you guys, a bunch of usernames with a bunch of like KDAs next to them, it was all coming from this match data object that I will show you guys more in the front end. In the front end, we'll be able to actually see these objects and be able to manipulate them and use them. But now all we are worried about is saying, hey, take the match data array that we created before and push this new match data object onto it. Okay, and so now we can actually give that array that we created. The match data array is going to have a bunch of different objects like I've shown here. It's going to have game1 object, game2 object, and we just want to make our response.json the actual JSON representation of this data array here. So I can just paste this in, and then now our response is going to show us that JSON of the match data array, and this final thing at the bottom, this is what gets sent to our front end. This is, if our request is successful and nothing else goes wrong, this is what the user is going to see is a JSON response with this match data array as the actual data itself. All right, so I know that was a bunch of stuff to get into. We're chilling now. We have our full Express server backend working, and we're pretty much showing if we were to call this GET request, it would show us the past 5 games for VLOTs, which is super great news. So now let's get started creating our React application. So if you're using VS Code, I would recommend to do a split terminal or something like that so you can keep your Express server running, because remember, you have to have both running at the same time, your React client and your Express server. So make sure you're in the same directory as your proxy server.js, and you can say npx create-react-app. I'm going to call this client, and sorry that's like wrapping around, guys, but here I'll show you. Create React app client, normal stuff. So once that is done, you can go cd into client and make sure you're in this correct directory, because now we are going to do an npm install of Axios. If you're in the wrong directory, you're just going to install Axios again on our other package.json. As you guys will see, when I go to this client and I go to the package.json here, is actually going to show Axios here, which is exactly what we want, because both our backend and our frontend are both using Axios, just to clarify that. So we can go into our React application, and then we can go to app.js, delete this entire header object, and you're pretty much going to have a blank app. And just for simplicity's sake, I'm not going to do like npm start or anything like that right now. I'm just going to create some HTML so we can get started. I'm going to make a little header that says, welcome to our proxy server app, as you guys kind of saw initially. I'm then going to create a text input. And so when creating these text inputs, I need this thing called React use state. So I'm going to say import use state from React. So now we have this use state thing that we can use, and we're going to want to save our text for our current search in here. So we can say const search text and then say set search text is equal to this use state. This is common use state syntax, and this is the actual text from an input we are going to create. So that's just going to be a string. Another thing is the actual data we're getting back from our API. So we can say something like game list is what we'd expect from our API, and we can say set game list. We know this is going to be a list of games, so we can make the initial state an array, because that's what we're expecting to get back from our request is an array, but with things actually inside of it. So now we can go in here and actually create the inputs and the logic there. So I can say input type is equal to text on change. This is common syntax for when you have a state that's a string and you want it to change whenever your input changes. You can get that event. You can make an arrow and you can say set search text. So it's setting this search text const here, and then set it to whatever the target dot value is of your input. So now we have a working input there, which is great news. Now I'm going to make a simple button for us to click to run our actual API calls. So I'm going to say get player games. Is this what I'm going to call it? Very simple name. Get the past 5 games from your player. Okay, so we can actually go and make this get player games function now. So I'm going to say function get player games. We can just have the events chill here. I'm not sure we're going to use it for this video, but just to show you guys that, this function is going to have an event attached to it that you may want to use. And then our API call string. So this is actually super important stuff. Is we have to, first of all, we have to import Axios eventually because we're going to make a get request here. The cool part is we're not going to make a get request to the Riot API. We're going to make a get request to our proxy server. So this is kind of where everything comes together in a pretty cool way. One quick thing just to prevent any issues is you want to go up here and you want to set your proxy equal to, let's say, localhost 4000. Wherever your proxy server is being hosted, we used 4000 for this video. This actually didn't change any of the logic for me. I've seen this online where it says it's necessary to prevent a lot of CORS errors. So if you're running into errors, make sure that your proxy in your package.json for the React client shows localhost 4000. Okay, so in this function, we can make an Axios get request, and it's the exact same syntax as a get request in our backend, and so that's pretty nice. But instead, we're going to make a get request to http //localhost 4000 /get past 5 games. And I actually forget exactly what we called it, so we can hop over to our proxy server, and it was just called past 5 games. So there we go. We can grab that string actually and say, okay, past 5 games. And then when we make a get request to this link, this is going to then hit the proxy server code over here and do all the logic that we've told it to do here, which is super great. Now we're going to do a dot then. I'm just going to say function response. So a little bit longer syntax than usual. Set the game list. This means we have a successful response. So we want to set the game list of our response dot data. And this response dot data is that array we're returning in our response at the very end, which is pretty cool to see kind of go full circle. And then just in case anything happens, I'm going to use this function syntax again, where we have an error and we can just console.log that error. And this is important to have the errors actually here in the front end because you might get some, so watch out. And this is all we really need for our function. We don't really need to return anything. As long as we're setting this game list, then we're pretty good to go. So now I'm not going to make any logic where we show anything to the front end quite yet. I'm just going to console.log our game list. We should be able to see this console log showing real data in our application. So let's hop over and npm start our application. So right now your application should look something like this. And if we press this button, it's going to run our get request to our proxy server. So we can press that. All right, so now we have the actual request, but here's an interesting thing. There was actually an error in how I did this. And so it's actually super great to see this error. As you can see right away, americas.api.riotgames.com LOL. There should be a slash between the .com and then the LOL. So we can go in and fix that real quick by going into our proxy server. This API call line around 26 should look like this. And this one down here should look like this. Sorry for the confusion there, guys, if it messed you guys up. Okay, so finally, after all that syntax confusion, we should be able to pretty much send a request in. Okay, good news. We're finally here. So now this API call has got us 5 different games, which each game being their own API call, and you can see all of the different info coming from the game. So the game type, what game version it was, like game mode, a serious amount of data is stored in all these different things. And so this API call, just as one API call, is super powerful in showing you how you can kind of stack Riot API calls on top of each other to make pretty interesting functionality. All right, so now we can make a basic front end that loops through this array, because remember, this array is being printed on our React side, so we have access to this array. Loops through the array and then just shows the basic data from each game. So we can go to our app.js and we can do some React code. So I'm just gonna say if this game list.length doesn't equal 0, that means I'm going to assume for this project we have data. There's going to be a React fragment here and then a React fragment here. And this one right here is we have data. And then this fragment on the bottom is we have no data. And so up here, you're going to have a game list with actual elements in it. Down here, it's going to have nothing. And so we can go to our front end really quick, do a quick refresh, and it's going to say we have no data. If you press this button, it's going to take a second, and then it's going to have actual data there, which means it has data ready to show. So I'm going to use map syntax. So I'm going to say game list.map and I'm going to say the actual game data we're looking at for that specific index, and then the actual get the index out of it too. And it's going to say, hey, for every single index in game list, map through it and create a React element from its parts. So we can do the same fragment syntax here by putting a React fragment around everything. React fragments are just like, easy ways to contain a bunch of different HTMLs. Why I use them is because it makes the structure more clear, and they pretty much just chill. They don't do anything to your styling, which is pretty nice. And so I can say, okay, let's have a header at the top that says something like the game is going to be index +1 if we want to label them like that. And so now we can have a div that's going to hold all of the different players. So I'm going to make a div here, and then in here we can go into the game data .info.participants, and make sure you wrap this in curly braces so recognize it as a variable. And so what this game data.info.participants is if we go to our front end, we can look here and be like, okay, we can go to the game data, which is this, and we can so go to the .info, which is here, and we can go to the participants. And so participants are all the players in a match. And so if we want to loop through all these different players, we can use map on this participants array as well, which is pretty interesting logic. So let's go in here and do the exact same thing. We can say .map, which means mapping over that participants array. And we can then say data, participant index, just so we don't use the same index twice, just in case. Use an arrow function. And for this one, I'm just going to say, make a paragraph player, get the actual participant. We can get the player, and we'll just number the players by saying participant index +1, kind of like I did with the index above. So it'll say player 1, player 2, etc. So this data from our map is showing the actual data that's being represented in the participants. So this is actually the data of the participant themselves. So we can say stuff like, okay, data.summoner name, which is a property is in that object. And I can say the KDA is equal to data.kills is what Riot calls it. And I can say data.deaths, data.assists. And so this is actually a really cool way to, access that participant's object. And so now we should be able to see all the different players for a certain game and also the game title above it, now that we actually have the map functionality in our React application. So let's go back over to our React and run the code again. Okay, so if you refresh your local host, you'll see here we have no data. Let's get the past 5 games from a player, and ignore this warning for now. It's because I didn't do some key stuff, but it's fine. I'm even gonna hide these messages, to be honest with you guys. And so now you'll see we're actually getting all the different games, and we are getting all of the data out of these games. So super great stuff so far. We pretty much have kind of a full logic. And the cool part about this is all this data is coming from our proxy server, which is then talking to the Riot API. We're not getting it from the Riot API directly from our front end, and so we don't run into any of the CORS errors you might have seen before. So this is pretty much the full project. One extra thing is this input doesn't really work right now to an actual certain user. It's not like I'm typing in VLOTs and doing it. It just, that is a const that is held in our proxy server right here, VLOTs. And so I'm going to show you guys how to pass a parameter to Express, and then I'm going to pretty much end the video there. So from the Axios perspective, we need to go in here and then add to the options. We are going to then say params is equal to an object. We are going to make a username parameter equal to whatever our search text is, because that's what the user inputs. And now this is going to give a parameter to our Express backend. We can now go over to the backend. So your backend should look something like this. Now we're, instead of using the actual hard-coded name VLOTs, we can say request.query.username is going to give us access to that username property we passed in as a parameter initially. So if we go back to our React application, we can go in here and now put in a different name of a person. And remember, this person has to have 5 recent games or else it isn't going to work. So we can get the past 5 games from a certain player who's different. And now you'll see it's going to get us the game data coming specifically from that player. So this is pretty much the full overall idea. So from this video, you kind of now have a proxy server working. You understand how to make multiple API calls in just one proxy call. And you also understand how to manipulate that logic, manipulate that data in your front end as well. So hopefully this helps you in creating, a Riot-based application and gives you a good idea of how to specifically use this stuff for React. Thanks for watching.